But today I was wanting to draw on the last project I mentioned around dairying transitions that was done in collaboration and conjunction with the New South Wales, Victorian governments and Dairy Australia, that really looked at why farmers were changing from grazing to housed dairy systems. And I'm going to report on that research, but for the audience today was hoping to focus more on what does this mean for farm transformation in general. Can we generate, I suppose, some insights to the transformative process that might get us thinking about how to support transformation more. And so I'm really keen on feedback from people here in the room and also online around whether this resonates and fits with your experiences of farm transformation and what contributions you might see this work having that perhaps we haven't seen. It is a work in progress. We're developing a paper from this research. So we know about the imperative for transformation that seems to surround us, the calls in whether it's media or industry or government that we need more transformation in relation to climate change adaptation. And it's interesting that the term transformational change actually came into the panel on climate change in about 2014. So I suppose the question that we want to ask is, what does this mean for the farm scale? And this is very pertinent in the Australian context. I could show probably hundreds and hundreds of graphs of some of the realities of climate change in terms of what the trends are suggesting in Australia. I've only picked two maps from some recent work. So the one on the left is representing the number of days Australia's mean temperatures were in the warmest 1% of records. And you can see that sort of trend through particularly the 2000s. And so part of this related in Victoria, which is the map on the right, and the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia, what was called the millennial drought. So 10 years of below average winter rainfall and temperature extremes. And so the map on the right is Victoria, the state that I'm from, and Melbourne sort of in the middle at the bottom. That there's thoughts about what's happening in terms of changes in farming and agricultural systems and future change that might be happening. So in the north of the state, variable and hotter conditions. In the south of the state might be more reliable and milder conditions. But that this is starting to, and we're seeing changes in the location of where different farming systems are operating and movement of systems. So you can see here, for instance, this has come from our Primary Industries Climate Challenges Centre, that there's movement of where dairying is more likely to be good, sheep systems, grain systems, viticulture systems, and even, for instance, something like cotton is moving further south or north. So there's this sort of pattern, I suppose, happening, and also what might be predicted to occur. So if we focus now on adaptation and transformation then, we see that adaptation is being defined as this adjustment of resources and systems and processes and practices with the intent to mitigate or develop opportunities given these sort of effects. And it's considered that, I suppose, that adaptation is what can reduce vulnerability. So then transformation is often described as a deep or large scale or even quick change in forms or structures, or an induced change. So the literature talks about systems reaching thresholds, where there's substantial changes to system characteristics. And there's some authors in the agricultural sector that have even sort of tried to define transformation as being a redistribution of a third of inputs and or outputs in production or consumption, and within a particular time frame. But really in this literature, there has been limited empirical studies of farm transformation practices and that limited focus on how transition occurs. There's emerging studies, but this is where our work, or we hope to position our work. So what we've noticed, I suppose, a bit in the literature is that we've seen, I suppose, since that 2014 period and transformation being a big focus in the IPCC report, that the discourse, the way people talk about adaptation and transformation is changing. So back in that period, many people were talking about adaptation as the avenue for large-scale change. That adaptation was about the transformation. But what we've seen more recently is that adaptation is more likely to be negatively associated with incrementalism and not of adequate scale, intensity or radicalness to bring needed transformation. And so adaptation now seems to be more associated with the maintenance of an incumbent system or process. And so what that's mean, in my opinion, I suppose, from looking at the literature, is that there's now seems to be this trade-off where incremental adaptation is considered bad because it's reactive, short-term, and it's about within a system change. And transformation is seen as good or better because we're wanting to change systems and we're needing to see new products, new services, new land use. And there's also this qualification then of adaptation, so to distinguish incremental from transformational in quality, the distribution, objective of change, etc. So, so this is sort of interesting, and whether this is really achieving or helping us when we don't really understand the transformation process. So when we look at some of the studies of found transformation, there are some patterns and processes that are coming out in some studies. So farming practice is seen as a response to negative or positive triggers that create different paths and path dependencies. A more recent study looking at agroecology and regenerative agriculture suggests that the change comes from induced epiphanies and including feelings of desperation and vulnerability, and friction and traction between the political, the personal and the practical. Others have talked about transformation being about mindset changes and there being different motivations to transform. Some people have talked about it's all about adaptive capacity, the capacity of people to change. And then recently there's been, I suppose, studies that have suggested that adaptation labour can be quite extreme, the work of adapting and the change to values needed in adapting. There needs to be more focus on that because of the significance in transformation. So I suppose our work tries to support knowledge around the gap that we're seeing about the elaboration of the farm scale processes, how change strategies are chosen and what practices are disrupted, and we're aiming to elaborate some of this to help understand the farm transformation process. So in doing this, we do understand farm transformation as a contested space. It's a socio-political object, and that we understand that the case that I'm talking about might be considered maladaptive, that there is a large discourse on the political economy of dairying and the critical food system scholarship that would suggest the systems I'm going to talk about are not the direction of transformation that we might value. But I suppose our argument is that if we can look at these sorts of changes that are happening, this will illuminate some of these transformative practices that we might be able to then think about how we support the transformation that's desired. So speaking specifically about the research project conducted in the Australian dairy industry, particularly in Victoria and New South Wales, was to look at why and how dairy farmers were transforming their farm system from predominantly 24/7 outdoor grazing system to house systems and what options for support might be provided. Just for, I suppose, I understand that these sort of systems are very prevalent everywhere else other than Australia. But in the Australian context, there's a particularly legislative definitions of different systems that have had to be developed and introduced associated with this change. And so I might be talking a little bit about dry lots or compost barns or dry pack barns or freestall. And this has specific meaning in the Australian context and represents some of the changes that are happening. In terms of the research that we conducted, on the left, the map of Australia, which represents in the light grey the Murray-Darling Basin, and it's within there that Northern Victoria and the Goulburn-Murray Irrigation District, the GMID, is where one part of the study was conducted. And this is actually quite important, as you'll see soon, that this is actually about the geographies of transformation, because farms in this area were experiencing a particular set of conditions that really was behind a lot of the changes. But we're also very fortunate to work in the state of New South Wales, which you can see some dots on the right-hand side of sort of the farms that were responding to a survey that we had done that represent large-scale geographies in terms of the place of different farms and different conditions that they might be faced in their farming. So we're sort of able to do a bit of a comparison, I suppose, of are we seeing different patterns in the changes to house systems through these different scales in a irrigation district versus a state. In terms of our conceptual framework, we've drawn on three theories, I suppose, of change. So because we're interested in how transformation at the farm scale happens, we've drawn on social practices theory, which suggests rather than change being about just behaviours, it is about the practices. So the meanings, competencies and materials associated with change, or are the change. We've also drawn on the sustainability transitions literature, the multi-level perspective. Some of you might be very familiar, but this talks about new practices, I suppose, emerging as niches, which are whether they become at greater scale is strongly influenced by regime conditions, policies, structures, or the socio-technical landscape, the way something happens, I suppose, in the society. We also strongly draw on resilience theories and theories of socio-ecological resilience, which really focuses on scales of change and the idea of transformability. How this applies to this project is we identified different fields of practice in the farming system, and we identified a chronological change. And this was helped by our colleagues in the dairy teams in the government and Dairy Australia that sort of saw the process of transformation being about farmers considering change, farmers investing in change, and farmers operating the change system. And what we see in our analysis is that there are definitely practices associated with starting, practices associated with becoming the change, and practices associated with then operating or being the change. And we're focusing on what were the systems of practice and how is this being influenced by policies and changes in the infrastructures at a regional level. Our study was qualitative. We undertook depth interviews with 25 farms across those two regions. Large variety of farms were changing. Some farms weren't moving fully to a house system, but we're investigating what those processes were. We also got to speak to 14 advisors that were providing expertise to different aspects of the change. While the research did involve surveys, I'm not reporting on those here. I'm reporting on the data analysis that was done through the qualitative coding of all the interviews, We did individual farm analyses, so story of the transition pathways for each farm. And we took a grounded theory approach to try and generate the new conceptualizations of transformative practices. I don't want to do death by PowerPoint too much, and we can't read this entire slide, but I was just wanting to show that we developed these sort of stories for each farm to conduct our cross-farm analysis. But then these became actually quite useful as case studies for industry. And then some of the farmers were quite happy for their story to be public. And so we looked chronologically at where change began and how change was described by the farmers, and then what was important about the consider, invest and operate stage. We developed some key messages for each farm and sort of what trajectory those farms might have been on. So in terms of what we found some distinct practices around this idea of the starting phase, even though this might have been over many years. So we found that farmers in both regions were responding and reacting to water markets, irrigation water price and availability. So what was really significant about this Victorian local region was there had been decades of changes, significant changes in water infrastructure, $1 billion in water infrastructure spent there. There was introduction of water markets, so this is quite key, the separation of land and water, so people could sell water separate from land. And that meant new water markets, temporary water, permanent water, and different ways that farmers could access that. But then that meant there were, you could say, stranded assets in dry land then as water moved. And so the land use possibilities then changed. So where it was felt there was going to be stranded assets of land, farmers started seeing perhaps we could buy this cheaper land and have crops 2 out of 10 years. So the possibilities there. While in New South Wales, land was a constraint for many farms because they lived in the coastal areas and this was high value land with urban populations and things. So the land possibilities were changing. Extreme weather events featured strongly in starting to consider the change, as did milk markets, milk prices, farm succession and the farming identity and what it was going to mean to change these systems. So just to give an example from the farms, just keep on time, we have water policy changes impacted on how farmers were seeing their relationship between water. There was a decoupling, I suppose, or a delinking in practice theory between irrigation and pastures, I suppose. So here are farmers describing that because of the exposure to the volatile and high water prices, especially in drought, they needed to move away from being so reliant on irrigation water. So they became opportunistic irrigators. Then on the cow welfare side, with changing heat conditions in New South Wales and humidity, it was trying to change that nexus of heat stress and cow performance. And then with the farm scale, in walking cows around the farm, it made sense to think differently about the system. And then we particularly noted, and this is I suppose the benefit of looking at very place-based change, that there was a galvanising event that accelerated this change for many farmers in the Victorian region. So in this very dry region of Victoria, they had a massive wet event in winter. And so farmers talked about that being scarring, awful, dreadful. We're never doing this again. So this was with cows outdoors and experiencing movement of cows and people in the mud and the wet, had then galvanised action to change to housing. We didn't see that obviously in New South Wales. We saw other types of things. So in New South Wales, We saw the idea of the weather events that were happening and the humidity that was occurring, that there was perhaps a desire for control in the system. And all flexibility, so not going fully into housing, but having some flexibility to be able to change in and out depending on conditions. So very much a place-based difference in these starting practices. And we also saw that succession was very important in considering the change. So here the farmer talking about knowing that this is a massive change and a big investment to ensure that the next generation that this is the identity they're wanting to build as well. And the idea of this time of transformation being very stop-start. So here's one example of people saying they talked about it in 2010. They did development applications in 2018, but they walked away. And it's only now this year, 2022, in this case, that they're thinking again of going this way. So I suppose if we stand back and we look at this starting period, we see that these are all about responding. They're responding practices. So there's changing material conditions where weather has turbocharged some change. And the responding practice were reorganising and switching crops, delinking the irrigation from pasture production and buying dry land, decommissioning grazing, commissioning feed pads and feeding infrastructure, and these new intermediate practices were giving them confidence to think about where are we heading now, the aspirations. So then what about the second phase, the becoming phase? We saw, I suppose, these practices of reconfiguring the farming system. So you can imagine that moving to house system, there was a lot of managing of materials, managing the things, the infrastructure, the barn, the effluent, the feed store, the kitchens, thinking about how cows are going to be cared for, growing the feed supply and managing big projects, multi-million-dollar projects, or multi-pound, sorry, in the UK, multi-pound projects. But there was also a lot of reconfiguring the advice and the work and the knowledge. So this is that idea of competencies in social practice theory, that there was this use of very specialised expertise creating new knowledge systems, mainly from overseas, mainly from California. There was also a big change to work routines, so from very seasonal work patterns, like the silage, the carving, the mating, to change to all year round, every practice being done each day. Then there was redundancy of practices with the herding and the paddock feeding, and there's a lot of monitoring and surveillance coming in, being of the system, so to ensure it's performing. And what we identified was this acceptance of the heightened governance around these systems, that other farmers talked about not wanting to go down this path. So this is where finances, so no banks in Australia want to lend, well, I'm sorry, it's changing now, but limited financial institutions want to invest in this because of depreciating assets and you're not able to get the value back from the land. So there had to be a key sourcing of the right sort of finance. Compliance, massive differences in each location for local council approvals and time to approvals, thinking about alternative income and thinking more about the social licence. I mean, every milk bottle in Australia this has come from pasture grazed cows. So these sort of things had to be thought about in these practices. So probably because of time, yeah, just these quotes that sort of talk about these changing practices or reconfiguring practices where buying land created other opportunities for feed storage and feed sales, and composting provided worm juice for sale, etc. And huge number of external expertise required, and the types of work routines and financing issues that I described. Interestingly, the scale of the system changed for one farmer meant that they went through a whole rehearsal of measuring and monitoring everything in the system before they'd even built the system, because of that, I suppose, the risk and the investment they were going through. So we can see that there's reconfiguring practices where things are stopped. There is a large amount of what you call adaptation labour, and there's a lot of care practices and emotional labour where there was a strong sense of farmers strengthening their identity as carers of cows and people. The being phase with the operating of house system was not straightforward either. So there was a lot of demands in managing interlinked farming systems with the cropping and the dairy, which I know is perhaps day to day for people in the UK, but was quite a different practice for these farmers. And for many of them, it was about dealing with the realities of the system, where there weren't that many other farmers doing it. So for one, they had got to the stage of these dry lots, but they described themselves as being emotionally, physically and mentally worn out, whereas others talked about the improvements that they were seeing in cow welfare, etc. So these being practices are really about accommodating the realities and learning and sharing the experiences. So to conclude, I suppose what we've learnt from this study is we can see that the transformative practices, well, we define these as responding, reconfiguring and accommodating, and they're about the aggregation of materials, competencies and meanings across these phases of change. So what does this, why does this matter, I suppose? Well, if you really think about those responding practices, they arose from policies and the operations of markets, as well as changes in the ecological systems. So from the outside, you might think these are incremental adaptations, buying land, changing crops, but in fact what they are indicators of the direction in which transformation is heading. So they should be, I suppose, looked at strongly rather than being criticised as incremental. The reconfiguring practices are complex and multiple, disruptive, and they can bring vulnerability. So policy and industry groups could mobilise and coordinate knowledge and networks to help reduce that cognitive and compliance load. And the transformation challenge is definitely there around the incumbent knowledge and advisory system, the legal and compliance systems, the financing systems. These are all not supporting, I suppose, the transformative process, or they often aren't. And so there could be expertise brought in to think about reducing the burden, which is like time and money around these transformations. So overall, I think some of our findings indicate that we should reject the incremental versus transformational dichotomy. Incremental adaptation here is part of transformation, and it's not one or the other. Incremental adaptation was opening up new possibilities, and so we suggest this should mean that we don't assume something is bad or inadequate. So it's part of incrementalism, or incremental adaptation is part of transformative practice. We also think that the idea that you incrementally build stepwise to transformation is far too simplistic, and we should be seeing these as new practices. And although we might see this case as being, as I said, maladaptation or supporting, just perpetuating the political and economic orthodoxy, that may be the case. But I think understanding this, the transformative practices here, shows that we can also see what's possible and innovative within the current regimes, but it could signal things about what might need to change if this isn't the ideal. And that really brings in the role of policies and structures that are supporting this transformation. So I suppose we'd argue that we do need to understand more these current responding practices and give greater support to the reconfiguring and accommodating practices. So just to end, I'd like to acknowledge, and I think some of my colleagues in Australia, in the Victorian and New South Wales governments and Dairy Australia have registered for today. Really acknowledge that this work was done with and for them, and acknowledge their support as well as those of the farmers and advisors as part of this project. Thank you. Sorry to have gone a bit over time,
no,
and hope we have questions. Yeah.
Stop sharing, Charlotte, and you can see the participants. Thank you so much, Ruth. That was fascinating. I should have explained earlier, this is a hybrid event. You might be able to see a range of CCRI faces behind me and beside me, and I know we've got a number of people online as well. Katerina is going to be managing the online questions, so if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I think that's probably easier. Meanwhile, I'll start off with this room. I'm sure there won't be any questions. Charlotte,
yeah, a really interesting Ruth. Yeah, so many questions. So something I wanted to ask is, so the farmers you worked with are undergoing these transformations towards housing, but I wondered whether it's a positive transformation or not. I imagine that, you know, members of the public, if they hear about the move towards housing, there could be quite a few negative views on that, and I just wondered to what extent that farmers are considering that. If anything then decided actually going to transform completely away from dairy and do something different. Yeah.
Yes, it's a very good question, and definitely this study only focused on this change. But in the work, we did get to speak to people that were thinking about maintaining a hybrid system, or thinking of exiting, or thinking of, yeah, I suppose alternative options. So we're definitely not, yeah, saying this is the pathway, this is one of multiple pathways. But I suppose I think that the processes we've revealed hold for all sorts of transformation. I suppose that's what I'm interested to hear. Absolutely, some of the farmers and definitely the advisors were very much talking about what in Australia we call the social license of farming, and they were concerned that, well, they wanted to see that their practices and the change of practice were legitimate, and this is part of the, I suppose, the industry, the concern they had, I suppose, for the industry, that if it's not talked about or if it's hidden, what might that mean for consumers? So I suppose the narrow road that I think is being navigated is that it's not about one being better than the other, but that we must acknowledge that many of the farmers do talk about the cow welfare benefits of the system. So the counter argument was, does that mean having cows in pastures, they're exposed to all these things, and that's actually a bad outcome from an animal welfare perspective? So it was actually a fine balance. Pragmatically speaking to some of the advisors that were associated with milk companies, and they were the ones that the companies, when the consumers ring the hotline, the phone call goes to them, and they were explaining that they basically say that well, for some farms and some contexts, it's really good to have cows being inside in controlled environments where they're not exposed to the heat and the wet and the things. So yeah, it was a live discussion. Yeah.
But you mentioned the labelling, the pasture-fed labelling. How's that changed then?
No, it hasn't at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Paul.
Yeah, I was thinking that very interesting presentation. I want to ask, did you look at how the practices evolve over time, and at what space of time were you seeing the changes in the practices, and what do you think may be responsible for that? And also, I want to ask a question about the system of practice. Uh, how do you look at it? Did you look at it looking at the zooming within, okay, what are the maybe sub practices within their practice, or also zooming out how this practice interconnect with other practices maybe within the family frame landscape? So were there practices that intersect to enable this change?
Yeah, probably a longer conversation with you separate, Paul, and I'm sitting next to you here, so at the CCRI, so I'll be able to follow up. Because it is, yeah, so first of all, we definitely looked at the change over time, and this is where the responding practices became I suppose the triggers for moving to house systems, but not everyone obviously under those same triggers were moving. And so this is where the practices towards housing changed as a in-place response for how they could see continuing in dairy. Those that weren't considering this or decided not to, and that might all change over time as well as pressures change. It was largely to do with it wasn't for them, it wasn't their identity as farmers. So grazing was part of their identity, that they couldn't share the journey with a manager, share farmer, or other farm successor. So they felt, yeah, this is something you had to do with support of a family or people that you would do it with. It was not a solo journey. So things like that were, and over time it was the extreme events and the external conditions that were creating the look for new alternative meanings and systems, yeah. The second part, the zooming in, zooming out, I suppose we've developed our own framework from social practice theories around practice fields, being the infrastructure, the cows, the work, and the systems of practice associated with those. And we are bringing out the interconnections or the nexus between those systems. So that's what our final paper is working on, which I'll talk to you about afterwards. Yeah, but we've had to develop that for farming and farming change, because in the literature there isn't, everyone just cuts it up into meanings, competencies and materials, and we're trying to have a way of representing that using farming systems.
Great. Chris?
Yeah, Ruth, from the back row, that was really fascinating, really interesting. I'm sure you probably know at the time here that, you know, in the UK, dairy, as reflected in the rest of UK agriculture, is divergent. You know, there's a sort of move to some extensive systems. There's also a move to more intensive. Now, my reading of what you were saying is this, in a sense, is it locking them into a more intensive system? I mean, I can see the appeal of a big shed. It's basically shade. And naturally we can provide that. But this is a very, very expensive umbrella. So, but you know, how does that roll out? I mean, is that part of the tension?
Yes, and it's a very good, I suppose, point. It is lock in, but this is where some believe, some have, their eyes are open. So farmers talk about this being the desired, the preferred, that it's not maladaptive. This is how they have to dairy from now on. So they don't, it's not seen as lock-in is the negative and the negative. In parts of northern Victoria, there actually was a big flood before I came here. And you think, well, but the house systems didn't go under. It affected equally the non-housed and the housed with the forage quality, for instance, because paddocks were flooded, or whether they were cropping or pasture. But it meant that there weren't farms having to be walked through through wet paddocks because they were housed. So it is definitely very diverse, and each for their own being sort of considered. But for some, the scale of the change is has been very, very challenging. And so this is where advisors and farmers say this is not just a let's build a shed, which is what's you know, there are some things that are happening that way. So for instance, we heard of instances where people are buying, because prices are going up for everything. You hear about the housing crisis and things like that in Australia anyway. There's a huge pressure on construction and building materials. So sometimes they're saying, well, we know we want to build a shed in the future, so we'll just buy $1 million worth of materials, but it sits there. Yeah. So yeah, it's that complexity of the systems of practice that are associated with the change. But I suppose in summary there, I think if we remove so this case being about this change to our house system, but think broadly about when we're calling for transformation in farming systems, these are the things that it does require and involve. And so even if the other paper I mentioned was the change to regenerative agriculture, and it reflects similar processes. So I think thinking broadly about these reconfigurations for transformation, I think is good.
Because it's not only the shed, is it? It's the whole forage side as well. Somebody got to cultivate, provide, provision that feed.
Yes. Yeah.
Katerina, are there any online questions?
There is a question. Pippa can't ask because she's in a silent workspace, so I'll just read out her question. Thank you for a fascinating presentation, Ruth. I learned a lot. How did your findings compare to Costner et al.'s paper? It sounds like you similarly found inciting incidents like extreme weather to be important. Can you elaborate a little on how these identities change as well?
Yes, thanks very much, Philippa. Yes, the Gosnell paper talks about flows and friction and traction, and I think that definitely holds. And also the mindset and identity of farming. So this all holds in our case. So this is why I think it's very important, because this is comparing regenerative changes to regenerative agriculture and intensive agriculture. So I suppose what we think we've advanced is more revealing the actual practices of change, not just saying that there's these flows and relationship between materials and identities, but actually identify what those practices are. So I think that's one of the ways we build on there. The identity aspect, I think everyone recognises transformation may have this sort of impact, but it's what to do about that. And I suppose what we've done in the reports and hopefully in the paper is, you know, what some of those aspects of how people become more comfortable with the change in identity and what that's meant. So in this case, the grazing identity, which I know American authors talk about as well, is very very strong, and people can't imagine how they would move away from that. And so we have all this evidence of farmers talking about, you know, one of the hard things was when you had a good season and the grass was growing really well, to not be able to put the cows on the grass, or the cropping identity. So now I'm a cropping farmer who milks cows rather than a dairy farmer, for instance. So these sorts of identity changes are highly important. Even the advisors talking about how they work with farmers on the whole change to the system, every aspect of the system of farming, how cows are joined, how heat's detected, how nutrition is managed, as a huge change in identity and what it means to be farming. And then that's where people do say, this isn't for me. This is not what I see doing, but my son might, or daughter might do this. This is what they want to do because they don't want to be in the elements. Yeah.
Any more, Katerina?
Yeah, we have a question from Rob. Thanks, Ruth. Are you aware of any research that utilizes Earth observation data, satellite imagery, to monitor physical changes on farms indicative of farming transformation?
Righty.
I was going to say.
It was a question.
Yeah.
I think it's
Yeah.
Katerina was called.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Questions in the
Yeah,
chat.
yeah, especially yours. Yeah, yes. Thanks, Rob. This is actually very pertinent. So, other than saying absolutely, to just put it in context, with the millennial drought and with the changes to water policy in Northern Victoria, this sort of observation mapping, plus being able to map where dairy farms were, showed significantly the contraction of farm numbers because you've got to identify where the dairy farms were. So it was used to monitor those physical changes. Similarly in New Zealand, the exact opposite, the massive expansion in dairying in the South Island of New Zealand. What I think some of those observational data or satellite data doesn't reveal is those practices I mentioned about the responding practices. So it was considered that the land that wasn't under irrigation anymore was abandoned or stranded assets, and the value of that land deflated because now the water was worth more. And so that the observation data from satellite doesn't actually show, but some farmers bought that land years later at a low price, but then used it as their cropping regime. So I'm sure now the satellite monitoring could see that because you'd see the cropping systems. But yeah, it was very important to actually understand that expansion and contraction at scale. And this is actually what fits with the nexus of practices that Paul asked me earlier. That yes, we were looking at the on-farm or the farm scale, but there are these collective intersects with specific policies and the results of that inland use. Yeah.
Okay, it's quite late. Do you want to grab Ruth at lunch?
Yeah, sure.
And we'll let Martin. I don't know if you're still there, Martin, but you've got a question about can advisory services on a one-to-one basis help farmers?
Yes, this is very interesting, Martin. I'm sorry, I know we don't have much time, but what we found, because we did sort of, let's look at the advisory network around this change. And so what we found was that the industry was helping keep sort of all advisors, no matter who they were, agronomists, farm management consultants, milk processing company advisors, you know, they'd visit some of the farms and people were sort of aware of what was happening and why it was happening and who was involved. So there's this a group of advisors that could say to farmers or refer farmers, you know, this is who's doing it, and this is the person you could talk to, etc. Then there was this other group of the expertise for each section. So the effluent specialist, the barn specialist, the siting of the barn specialist in America, the etc. So the one-to-one advice, there were farm management consultants that did the numbers. So a farmer would come and say, I'm going to do this. Could you help me around the finance and the numbers? But there was not one advisor or one person that was advising on the whole thing. And there's not the market for it. So advisors talk about there's not the critical mass where you can have that in America or potentially here and in Europe. And so this is what farmers were doing themselves. They were having to coordinate the advisory system for themselves, but then the industry was trying to operate to support referral and links. But it got very specific. You know, the bedding material is all about where you are and what's available. And so to have someone who was across the expertise of the type of bedding for the system that happened to be in northern New South Wales versus Victoria was not there. So the advisory space is very interesting, but the one-to-one advice was multiple.
That's interesting. Okay, great. I think we better conclude there to let everybody have their lunch. Let's thank Ruth one more time for that fascinating.